So for those of you who might be new that are just tuning into this program and aren't really sure about what Ganastado is the protected place, is what the name was given by the Haudenosaunee after the reclamation of the lands of the former Douglas Creek Estates housing development in 2006. So as part of the process of rehabilitating the lands of Ganastado, the Confederacy Council also entered into a communications protocol agreement with the province of Ontario through the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs. That protocol agreement was basically a process by which the Confederacy Council could communicate with the province, because if you're familiar with the Haudenosaunee, then you understand that our treaties are with the British Crown. We don't have a relationship with Canada or Ontario, and so it was designed to assist, to create a process that allowed the Confederacy to communicate or to talk with the province in a process that was similar to the Turo. It's set up the same way, based on the principles of peace, respect, and friendship, and so that it was designed to allow us to communicate. The Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs chose to suggest a process that was more outside outside of the communications process and was more designed to accommodate what they want to see. If you understand Canadian politics, you understand that the federal government and its relationship with the Indian Act process is required to deal with the elected band council. And so what the communications protocol, or what the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs was attempting to do, was to bring the Confederacy back into the process that they were comfortable with. And that's always been an ongoing issue with the Confederacy and its relationships with anybody, be it Canada or Ontario, municipalities, ministries within Canada. It's always been a difficult situation because they are always accustomed to dealing with what they call First Nations in a process that's been designed and set up under the Indian Act process. This process that the Confederacy Chiefs Council had set up with the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs was completely outside of that process. So it was unique, and it was directly involved specifically to deal with the Haudenosaunee in a more nation-to-nation-like relationship. And so because of that, and because you have other parties who are wanting to be involved with the issues such as Ganastado, the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs attempted to bring the Confederacy back into a process where they would have the Band Council as well as Haldimand County sitting at the table along with the province, and they were hoping that the Confederacy would participate. And just to give you some ideas of why that didn't happen, if you recall back through the negotiations from 2006 through probably 2009 when they ended, the first thing that the Confederacy Council did when they appointed that the team they designated certain chiefs and sub-chiefs to sit at that table with Canada, Ontario, the first thing they did is they asked the province or suggested to the Crown, which is Canada, Ontario at the time, to get rid of the third party on those lands. And so that was the first thing that the Confederacy did to help resolve the issue of so many parties attempting to have a say at that table. And so in the minds of the Confederacy, that was dealt with in 2007. So in their minds, there was no need to bring Haldimand, for instance, back to the table because the province was purchased the land, and so it took out any third-party interest, and it was supposed to be an engagement that was specifically designed to deal with the Haudenosaunee. The reason that the elected system, also, if you recall, through the negotiation process, the Band Council was a party to those negotiations, but they were brought in as people. So for the Confederacy's perspective, the chiefs were sitting at the table negotiating with the Crown, and those other people that were sitting there, be whether they were elected people or whether they were community citizens or whoever, they were sitting there just as Haudenosaunee citizens, and it wasn't like a tripartite thing of what normally Canada and Ontario are designing usually to set up. And so it was the understanding of the Confederacy that they were there as a government, and that those individuals that were there were part of that government. Unfortunately, in 2009, when things started to happen, and I believe that the instance where the Band Council reopened its litigation with Canada, that's when the negotiation process fell apart. So anyway, I'm just kind of giving you a recap of what had happened, and it sort of explains why the Confederacy today is still saying to the Crown, we don't need to have those other bodies there because we are sitting here as Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee governance rests with the Confederacy Chiefs Council, that all the other people that are involved, no matter what group that you are from, whether you're a band council or a man or a woman or whoever, you are part of that process, you're part of that circle, but you're within that circle, and the Confederacy Council would speak for you. Perhaps this would be a good time to talk a little bit about the process of communications and what it had hoped to accomplish. And so one of the things that was happening at that table, there was a number of items that Ontario wanted to discuss. One of them was the rehabilitation of the birchlands. And we've pretty much come to almost a conclusion of that. As you're aware, the land is not being farmed right now, but we are working. As a matter of fact, the farmers are out there this week and they're going ahead and planting the, or not planting, sorry, they're working the land and they're doing the fertilization of the land that was recommended in council and that the Confederacy supported to do, is to revitalize that land because it had been very much worn down from the continual planting for the last few years. And so there was a recommendation after the soil was tested that those lands be brought back up to par, I guess, and so fertilization is going on this week. So that's one thing. Another issue that was being discussed at the communications table was, of course, the former Douglas Creek, which we refer to as Gunnestoto, and some of the areas that they wanted to talk about is specifically they were, looking at the rehabilitation, the planting of trees. They wanted to talk about the removal of the trailer, things like that. Very, I guess, housekeeping types of things. One of the things that we always continued to put forward, what the Confederacy put forward, is that it was in our land registry, and the Birch property was in our land registry. And so we had this ongoing dialogue with Ontario, who were looking for ways for their side of the wampum on how they would deal with that. Haudenosaunee has it in their land registry, and so what we said to them is we could assist them in finding a way to put that land within their land register, recognizing it as Haudenosaunee land. And so that was some of the discussions we were having. So as part of the discussions with the province of Ontario and the communications process, specifically speaking about Douglas Creek, as I said, we talked about having that trailer moved from the front. They talked about having the lands cleaned up, the grass cut, those kinds of things, housekeeping things. But we also talked about the installation of the fence. And this came up quite a few months ago. And one of the things that we talked about was how our people felt in 2006-07 when they came to the negotiations table and they told the chiefs that the school people, the Catholic school that's there, that they wanted to put a fence up because the children were afraid. And there was a lot of discussion at that time, and our people were not quite happy with the idea of a fence. And at that time, we even talked about how it was like building walls. It wasn't really assisting in the process. But the Chiefs Council and part of the process had agreed that, okay, then the fence is going to go up. And at that time, they suggested that fence go right from the school all the way down to the tracks. Deal with it right now. However, Ontario and Canada didn't agree to it at that time. So when it came back up several months ago, and this started around Earth Day, when we started to do the cleanup, and there was going to be cleanup at Gunnestoto, well, didn't we find a dump that had been put there? And so that was when those discussions started happening with the province. In and around that time, it's like, listen, we can't just keep dealing with this. Prior to that, it was when the grass was going to get cut by Guyana, and they came across that garden, and that garden that had been extended. And so those issues that were on the table, and part of the reason that the Confederacy finally came to the conclusion to proceed with the fence is because during those discussions with Ontario, we weren't able to make any headway. We were talking about it. We were talking about going ahead with the fence. They agreed to put the fence up. They received the quotes as they knew that we were putting it out to tender, so they agreed that it was going to tender. We get the quotes, and then all of a sudden everything stops. There's no more meetings, and this was during the election time, and so we respected that. The chiefs respected it, understood that it was because there was elections going on. They were coming back telling us, that they couldn't meet. Well, then after the election, still nothing and still no meetings. So after the Ontario elections, the Chiefs raised the issue a number of times and attempted to, anyway, to set up a meeting with Ontario to deal with the issue of not just the encroachment of the lands, not just the dumping, but also the safety and security. Because everyone's well aware that we have local activists who attempt or continue to disrupt. They continue to go onto the land. The Chiefs reminded Ontario that there was a protocol set in place during the negotiations. There was a buffer zone that the Ontario Provincial Police were supposed to be upholding, and and that all of these things were in violation of the buffer zone. That the activists would come right into the Douglas Creek or to Gunestado. Our people were being charged with breaching their probation and breaching their conditions, and yet the OPP were bringing this person right onto the site and right into the vicinity where our people were. And so the Chiefs were very concerned about safety and security, very concerned about the heightened inciting of violence, and so that they finally directed us to go ahead and put that fence up. And so it wasn't just something that they did on their own. It wasn't a unilateral action like Ontario has proclaimed, but excuse me, in fact, the discussion and idea of a fence goes right back to the negotiations in 2007 when it was brought up at that time by Ontario and Canada, supported by the Confederacy, and then brought forward in 2012, 13 through the negotiations with Ontario, and then moved on it this year by the Chiefs Council. So the construction of the fence began. It's ongoing right now, and it actually looks really good, and it's starting to help. What it did is it brought the Caledonia residents along Thistlemore to work along with the Haudenosaunee too, and I think that's something that we really need to talk a little bit about, because everybody tries to make this all about us and them, like there's this big fight between the Six Nations and Caledonia, and that's not true at all. There's been a lot of work that's been done by the Haudenosaunee to attempt to educate the outlining citizens along the Grand River and in other areas too. But so what that fence did is it brought neighbors out from Caledonia to work alongside of the Haudenosaunee. We're working together, they're clearing the brush, they're putting the fence up, the kids are playing ball. It really shows you the reality of our situation, as opposed to what certain elements of media want to portray, or even Ontario, sort of suggesting that that the unilateral action was causing all these difficulties and stuff. And I don't think it caused any difficulties at all. I think what it did is it helped bring a little bit more peace back to the situation. And that really is the true responsibility of our Confederacy Chiefs Council. When it's looking at things, it has to really look at how do we maintain the peace. And nothing that Ontario did, nothing that the Ontario Provincial Police did, nothing that Canada did throughout that process ever really looked at how do we keep the peace. They abandoned the process that was agreed upon. They didn't follow through to ensure that those things were being respected, and so the Chiefs Council took it as part of their duties to make sure they brought that peace back to Gunestado and back to the neighboring communities. And I think that in itself speaks a lot about the who the Confederacy is and what their responsibilities are. After the Ontario election, and after they didn't come back to the table, and then an invitation came out to the Confederacy Council to participate in these meetings with the elected band council, the town of Haldimand, Ontario, and the Haudenosaunee. The first thing that happened was the Chiefs received this invitation, but then they didn't get told where the meeting was. There was no date or time. It was just, we want you to come to the meeting. Now, mind you, the Confederacy Council did send a letter back declining the invitation, but it went on to explain why it declined the invitation, and why they believe that the process of communications set up with the former Minister of Aboriginal Affairs at that time was Kathleen Wynne, now Premier Wynne. And how that process differed, why it differed, and we, what I just talked about, those areas of relationship building, because basically that was what it was about. It was about relationship building. It wasn't designed to make any great decisions or anything like that. It was, how do we get through these things? How do we help one another? How do we help educate Ontario and Canada to understand what their role and responsibility is as representatives of the Crown. You know, when negotiations first started in 2006, most municipalities didn't even realize that they're still part of the Crown. So this has been an ongoing process for our Confederacy chiefs to let people know what is that relationship? What is a two-row wampum? What is that relationship between the British Crown and the Haudenosaunee, and how do we help Canada and Ontario figure out where they fit in? And so rather than dealing with 3- or 4-headed crowns, the Confederacy conceded to have a 2-headed crown, which was Canada-Ontario. And when Canada did walk away from the negotiations, it was Ontario through Premier Wynne, like I said, then the Aboriginal Affairs Minister, who came up with the protocol agreement, the communications protocol. And so the Confederacy felt that that was a very good tool to help build the relationship between Ontario and the Haudenosaunee and dealing with situations such as this one. It's not just Douglas Creek or Gunnestoto, it's not just Birch. There are many areas that Ontario has in a relationship with the Haudenosaunee, and even within the Haudenosaunee Development Institute, we're dealing with some of the ministries of Ontario. And so the protocol agreement was viewed as a tool for the Confederacy to be able to talk to these ministries and in a way that that was consistent with our relationship based on our treaties, and it was something that was going to move us into the future, I think, in a way that established more of a process, structured process, because you have to have structure. It's not necessarily, and I think that where the minister took offense at our last meeting, what he took offense of was the fact that it was suggested that by trying to force the Confederacy chiefs to come into a table with the Band Council, with the municipality, under the current processes set up by the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs, former Indian Affairs Canada, was likened to genocide, or and he really didn't like that. But the fact of the matter is that that system was forced on our people. That's the truth. And so when we had the meeting, and when the chiefs were trying to explain why they didn't want to sit in a process that was under the Indian Act or designed to you know, in a nice way of saying, let's get all the little Indians at the table and let's have them all sit together, and so that we're comfortable. You know, and it's always about making Ontario or Canada, it's always about making the colonizers comfortable, but what about how our people feel? What about our comfort? And so what about the Confederacy Chiefs Council? What about how comfortable they would feel if they had to more or less abandon their principles and abandon their beliefs and understanding of who they are as a Haudenosaunee citizen, and come and sit at a table that's designed to pretty much wipe you off the face of the earth? How comfortable do you think they would be at that? And so when it was suggested to Minister Zimmer that it was too much like assimilation and it was an act of genocide, he didn't like it, but that was the truth. And it's unfortunate because a lot of our people don't understand. They take it personally, even representatives of the Band Council system. It has nothing to do with them as individuals. It has to do with the fact that a system was brought in at gunpoint. And people continue to say that there was no guns, it wasn't like that, and that's not true, because we know that there's elders in our community that were there, they witnessed it. And we know that the fact is that in the 1800s and the late 1800s, when the superintendent of Indian Affairs was sitting in our council, they were sitting right in our council meetings. We know that. They were sitting there amongst the chiefs. The minutes show that. But what they were doing at that time is they wanted them to take over that Indian Act system, and the chiefs considered it. And what they said, though, is when they realized that they had to take the whole thing, they said no. They weren't going to do it. And so you have this confusion amongst our people today where people are running around saying, well, the chiefs accepted the Indian Act. That's not true. What they had said at that time and through those minutes was that they considered some of those things might be good for their people, but when they were told they had to take the whole thing, they rejected it outright. And that's when, in 1924, Duncan Campbell Scott and the order came in for the RCMP to come in and remove our chiefs. And so there's a whole lot of our history that people don't really have a clear understanding of, but they also take it very personally when things are talked about, like assimilation and genocide. And I think that's the problem that that we face as Haudenosaunee today, and when you have Ontario suggesting that you have to have all the parties at the table, we need the band council there, we need the men's fire there, we need the Mohawks there, we need, I don't know, you name the groups, there's a number of them out there. And for the Confederacy, every time they do that, they sit there and they're looking at them saying, but this is our process of what was put together that includes all of those people. It's colonization that created all those different groups. It's not something that came from our peacemakers. It's not something that came through us as Haudenosaunee citizens. Those things were created out of colonization. And so the difficulty that we face as a nation today, as a Haudenosaunee nation, is that we recognize that the Confederacy Chiefs process was put there through the peacemaker, and the structure of decision making has to come through that council. And so today, what we need to do is we need to educate our people on how do they have their voice back within that structure then. If they don't currently understand who their chief or clan mother is, or they don't understand what's happening or the process of council, they don't attend council meetings, maybe they're a little bit nervous about it, I don't know. But there has to be a way to help them to understand that this is the process, this is a decision-making process. Yes, you are part of that process as an individual, but all those little groups, you don't bring that group in with you. When you come into the Confederacy Council, you're there as a Haudenosaunee citizen. You're not there as a band council. You're not there as a men's fire. You're not there as a Mohawk workers group. Those things all came later, and they came as a result of colonization. So when Ontario came and refused to sign that agreement with the Confederacy Council, they refused to renew the protocol agreement, what they did is they basically attempted to backdoor the Confederacy by coming into the community and meeting separately with all those groups. They were deliberately and I don't know what the word is, but deliberately undermining the process, undermining our Confederacy Council again, and attempting to usurp, I guess, the authority of our council by going and giving it to individual groups and promoting their own colonization again. And that's why it was said to Minister Zimmer that your actions is a form of genocide against the Haudenosaunee, and that's why I believe that he got so upset, is because that was the truth. That's exactly what they were doing. They did the same thing in the 1800s. They did the same thing in 1959 when our people attempted to take back the Confederacy Council building. The police came in at that time, whacking them over the heads. People were arrested. Every time the Confederacy takes a step to assert itself as a government, and in 2006, when the people brought the Confederacy back to the table and back to the forefront and lifted the government back up, ever since then, Ontario and Canada as a crown have been trying to put it back down and trying to bring back the systems that they're comfortable with, as I indicated, and something that they can control. And that's what this really is all about. It's about power and control. In a nation-to-nation relationship, there are no winners and losers. The basis of the two-row is that everybody wins. That's what our chiefs are obligated to work on, and that's what they try to do at those tables. And so when they're there talking to Ontario, and when they're there attempting to come to an understanding of how do we deal with these situations, how do we clean up Birch so that it's ready and it can be revitalized, even that didn't get respected. Ontario went ahead and made decisions, and a lot of unilateral decisions, that just totally disregarded what the Confederacy was trying to put forward. And so the chiefs have always attempted to try to make sure that there are, it wasn't about winners and losers. And unfortunately, I think that is a big part of the difference between democracy, according to Canadian standards, and democracy within the Haudenosaunee, is because when we talk about the two-row, we talk about those values, those peace, respect, and friendship. It's in earnest to try and come to an agreement so that everybody wins. There's no winners and losers. Everybody's happy. So whatever decision that you make, it should have, it should come to something like that. And so that's what I understand their obligation is, and that's what they were attempting to do through that communications protocol. So now here we are. The protocol agreement has not been renewed. The chiefs have proceeded to ensure that the safety and security and peace is held at Gunnestown, and are continuing with the rehabilitation according to, like I said, according to what they had discussed, not just at the table, but in our council as well. after the delegation from the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs came into the community, they met with the Men's Fire, they met with the Band Council, they've had Haldeman at both of those meetings. What finally did happen is that the minister agreed to come to a meeting with the chiefs. We continued to offer that invitation. And so they agreed, and the minister came to that meeting, as I had talked about, where it got a little bit heated there because of that, the suggestion that what they were asking of the chiefs was more along the lines of assimilation and act of genocide. And so the end result of that meeting basically was that Minister Zimmer continued to extend an invitation to the Confederacy Chiefs Council to participate in this process over here that included the band, that included Haldeman, that included Ontario. And our chiefs were very clear and very direct with Minister Zimmer, and basically told him that that they were going to, there was two things that were discussed by the chiefs, basically the outcome of that meeting. The first thing that the chiefs told them was that that we were standing by our land registry. So the Haudenosaunee have stood by the fact that that land is now in the Haudenosaunee land registry, the lands at Gunnestoto, and that we are standing by that. The other thing that they said is that they would continue to keep the invitation open to the minister to come back to the table with the Chiefs Council through that communications protocol agreement, inconsistent with our principles and the protocol, I'm sorry, of the two-row wampum. So as a result of the position that the chiefs took at that table at the protocol agreement meeting, the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs walked away from the table, indicating that they continued to invite the Chiefs Council to participate in a meeting with the Band Council, with Haldeman, and with Ontario. And our Confederacy reaffirmed its position that they would leave it open to Ontario, the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs, to continue in the communications protocol agreement with our Chiefs Council and to continue to meet that way. We haven't had any formal meetings or any formal communications with the ministry since that time, and I do understand that perhaps the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs is meeting with Haldeman County and the elected Band Council, but I don't know any details of those meetings. As a result of our meeting with the ministry, the Chiefs Council then held a couple of sessions, internal discussions about how to deal with that situation, and what they came to is that they wrote a letter to the minister, or Premier Wynne. Because Premier Wynne was actively involved as Minister of Aboriginal Affairs at the time, and because being the Premier now, the Confederacy felt that they were obligated, based on the two-row, to advise Premier Wynne that the minister's actions have undermined what they believe was her intentions, and good intentions at that time, to build a communications process with the Haudenosaunee. And so they reached out to Premier Wynne to advise her that they were still open to communications, and that they were looking to her for guidance on how for her to deal with Ontario. As of today, we have not had any response from Premier Wynne's office, and like I said, I don't believe there's been any further communication with the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs. We will be proceeding, as I indicated, with a cleanup of Gunnestoto. We're proceeding with the fertilization of the birchlands. The Haudenosaunee are moving forward with all of the lands that they have put into their land registry, ensuring the protection of them, including the lands at on Plank Road, and ensuring their protection, ensuring that they're maintaining them and looking after them.